Hello and welcome to Epiphytic Cacti. The first video for this channel is going to be about your basis substrate. This is just a starting off point and then you can make your own. I highly suggest that people experiment, but as a beginner, let's say you get a couple of rhipsalis cuttings or you get a couple of epiphyllum cuttings from somewhere. This is a starting off point. Epiphytic cacti tend to grow in the trees, in rainforests, cloud forests. So what they're growing in is not this kind of thing. So what we do when we do this in our own environment is we're basically like thinking about how does this grow in the wild and how can I mimic this in my own home or in my own greenhouse or in my own garden. Yet a species, you can generally go and look up where that species grows. And then you can see what their climate is like year-round. And you can try to mimic that. And there are a lot of different things that I've tried that have worked. There are a lot of different things that I've tried that haven't worked. So let's start off by looking at what we have here and why. First, we actually have potting soil. It's just your basic potting soil. You definitely want to try to find a really high-quality soil. It has a slightly acidic pH. Your basic potting soil holds moisture. This adds nutrition to your mix. And what the slightly acidic pH actually does is it allows it to pick up the maximum volume of nutrients at one time. Perlite has no nutritional value. It doesn't really change the pH. And the only thing it really does is add drainage. A lot of people don't particularly like using perlite because it has a tendency to float. So over time, your perlite can actually raise to the top of the pot, while your other ingredients can start pushing to the bottom, making the bottom of the pot sort of compacted. And you don't really want that for epiphytic cacti. So if you can get it, pumice is actually another ingredient that works really well that you can use in place of the perlite. And the last thing is going to be pine bark. This is your basic like orchid pine bark. I use a very high quality orchid bark. I do not use any of the barks that I can just pick up at a big box store. I'm generally going to go and order very specifically Orchiata bark. So Orchiata is just a brand. The grade of this bark is actually just standard. This is the small grade bark. I find that when I open the bag and I pull this out, it has a very nice smell. It doesn't smell like a lot of the big box store brands. Like I can open the bag and it smells really musty and moldy, and I have used it before in the past, and what I found is that I was having to repot pretty quickly because it was already so degraded out of the bag and it had like mushrooms were sprouting out of it. I do know that a lot of people have a tendency to choose not to use pine bark. And part of the reason why is because of it decomposes. For some people, it's like the issue of having to repot all the time, right? A lot of epiphytic cacti, they have spines. They have like hairy, horrible little thorns on them that kind of attack you. And I can't blame people for not wanting to repot them like every year because their mix is decomposing. I have not found that problem with the Orchiata bark. I find that it lasts for a long time. For a lot of people, I know that they'll actually substitute, instead of using this bark, they will substitute it with cactus mix, which is mostly comprised of sand. I can hands down say, because I've tried it before, that it will not work in my area. It definitely holds more water, and that is an issue for me. And as far as bark goes, like if pine bark has the ideal pH levels, which is one of the reasons why you use it, because it has a slightly acidic pH. If you want to try other barks, like there's a lot of other really high quality barks out there. There's like kiwi bark. I think I would have a really hard time getting a hold of kiwi bark. But if you want to try some other kind of bark, some more exotic bark or less exotic bark, if what you need to do is figure out what that pH is, and try to keep it in that 5.5 to 6.0 pH range, because that's really going to be ideal. There are other ways to mitigate pH things, but that's not really a topic for an intro beginner mix video. And I think that what you can see here is that what we actually have are equal parts. Equal parts of potting soil, equal parts of perlite, and equal parts of pine bark. And this is just the basic mix. After that, I do know a lot of people like to put in a lot of different kinds of nutritional type things, bone meal, blood and bone, probiotics. I've heard of people having great success with things like worm poop, alpaca poop. I've even heard of dog poop. I personally would steer clear of the dog poop, but there was a lady that swore by it. And so it apparently worked for someone. Like I said, you can experiment and do what works best for you. Now I'm going to use my trusty trowel and mix this up. You definitely want to use gloves and a mask when you mix this. There are hazards for this dust. And just breathing it in is even uncomfortable. So this is fairly difficult to mix up. I know a couple of people who do different things. Like, you don't have to mix a batch this big, of course. I mix batches this big because I need batches this big. But if you only need a little bit of it, you don't need to create like this huge tub. I know some people that will put them in 10-gallon buckets and like put the ingredients in, and then they'll roll it around. A good friend of mine did this amazing thing where he used a cement mixer for this kind of thing. There we go. It's beautiful. It's nice and fluffy. You can see that it's nice and chunky. It's pretty. So the last thing that I actually like to add are expanded clay pellets. Specifically because in my area, it just rains too much. It is generally used for hydroponics. So if you're trying to find it and like you can't find it online in your area, look for a hydroponic store. But I like to rinse my hydroton. And here's an example. Here's an example of what you will find. Like, it's just very, very dusty. It's very dry. It's very dusty. You can see the residue that it's leaving. And this is generally what it looks like when it's rinsed out. I just get the standard size of this. It adds drainage, right? It's a chunky thing, kind of like the perlite, which will add drainage. But these actually hold moisture. Whereas perlite, it's porous, but it doesn't really hold moisture in the same way. It's something that actually helps me both with extreme drainage and with water retention at the same time, if that makes sense. It sounds a little bit strange, but for me, this works. So I just eyeball it, just dump that in there. I have a whole second bucket here, just dump that in there. And then I will just continue mixing. There you go. And there we have it. And at the end, this is about what it looks like. Anyway, this is the basic substrate. I hope that in some way this was informative.